Welcome back to part 2 of the Inner Child series. Childhood emotional neglect and the missing self. What happens when nobody teaches you who you are? Many women can identify what hurt them: the criticism, the rejection, the instability, the conflict. But some of the deepest wounds were not created by what happened. They were created by what never happened. Nobody taught you how to understand your emotions. Nobody helped you trust yourself. Nobody showed you that your needs mattered. Nobody reflected back who you were. And when that happens, something important can go missing. Not your personality, not your potential. Your connection to yourself. Section 1. The wound is often what never happened. When people think about childhood wounds, they often think about painful memories: the criticism, the shouting, the instability, the rejection, the obvious moments that left scars. But emotional neglect is different. Emotional neglect often leaves no single event to point to. No obvious memory, no clear moment where everything changed. Instead, it leaves an absence. A gap. Something important that should have happened, but never did. Because children need more than food, shelter, and education. Children need emotional guidance. They need comfort. They need validation. They need someone to help them understand what they're feeling. They need someone to notice when they're struggling. They need someone to communicate: "I see you. You matter. Your feelings make sense." Without those experiences, children often learn to adapt. They learn how to function, how to achieve, how to stay quiet, how to avoid conflict, how to become what the environment needs them to be. But they never fully develop the emotional foundations that help people understand themselves. This is why emotional neglect can be so difficult to identify. Because people often compare their experiences to others. They think, "Nothing terrible happened. I wasn't abused. I had a roof over my head. I should be grateful." But emotional neglect isn't defined by what you had. It's defined by what was missing. And one of the most painful realities about emotional neglect is this: you cannot miss something you were never taught to expect. If nobody ever validated your emotions, you may not realize validation was missing. If nobody ever helped you feel emotionally safe, you may assume emotional safety isn't important. If nobody ever taught you how to trust yourself, you may believe self-doubt is simply part of who you are. But healing often begins when we recognize that something important was absent, not because we want to blame, not because we want to stay stuck in the past, but because we cannot heal what we refuse to acknowledge. Section 2. The missing mirror. One of the most important jobs a caregiver performs is something many people never think about: reflection. Children discover who they are through relationships. They learn about themselves through the responses they receive from the people around them. Imagine a child feeling frightened. A healthy caregiver might say, "You look scared. It's okay. I'm here." The child learns something important. What they're feeling has a name. What they're feeling makes sense. And what they're feeling can be managed. Now imagine that same child repeatedly receiving no response, or criticism, or dismissal, or being told they're overreacting. Slowly, the child begins learning a different lesson. Maybe my feelings don't matter. Maybe I shouldn't trust myself. Maybe I should ignore what I feel. This is where emotional disconnection often begins. Because children don't naturally know who they are. They learn through reflection, through attunement, through being understood. through having their internal world acknowledged. Without that mirror, many children become highly skilled at reading other people. They learn what everyone else wants, what everyone else needs, what keeps everyone else comfortable. But they struggle to recognize themselves. And this can continue well into adulthood. Many women become experts at understanding others, yet feel completely disconnected from their own emotions, their own needs, their own desires, their own identity. Because when nobody reflects your inner world becomes difficult to trust. And eventually, you stop looking inward altogether. Healing requires rebuilding that mirror, learning to become curious about yourself again, learning to ask, what do I feel? What do I need? What matters to me? Because those questions were never supposed to be mysteries. Section 3. Why you feel disconnected from yourself. One of the most common consequences of emotional neglect is a feeling that is incredibly difficult to describe. Disconnection, not necessarily from other people, from yourself. You may find yourself constantly asking others for advice, looking for reassurance, seeking confirmation before making decisions, not because you're incapable, but because somewhere along the way, you stopped trusting your own voice. Maybe you've experienced moments where someone asks, "What do you want?" And your mind goes blank. Not because you don't care, but because you've spent so much of your life focusing on everyone else's needs that your own needs feel unfamiliar. Perhaps you've achieved things, built a career, raised children, supported others, taken care of responsibilities, yet still feel a strange emptiness underneath it all, as if something important is missing. Many women living with the effects of emotional neglect know exactly what everyone else needs. They know when someone is upset, when someone is disappointed, when someone needs support, when someone needs reassurance, but when asked what they need, they struggle to answer. Because emotional neglect often teaches children to become externally focused, the environment becomes the priority. Other people's emotions become the priority. Other people's comfort becomes the priority. And over time, the relationship with self begins to disappear. This is not a character flaw. This is not selfishness. This is not weakness. It is adaptation. A child learned how to survive by paying attention to everyone else. The problem is that survival strategies often continue long after the environment has changed. And eventually, healing asks a powerful question. What would happen if you became just as interested in yourself as you've always been in everyone else? For many women, that question marks the beginning of reconnecting with the self that emotional neglect slowly pushed into the background. Section 4. Why your needs feel inconvenient. One of the most common effects of emotional neglect is something many people never recognize: the feeling that your needs are a problem. Not because anyone says it directly today, but because somewhere in childhood, your nervous system learned that having needs created discomfort. Perhaps your emotions were dismissed. Perhaps your needs were ignored. Perhaps there simply wasn't enough emotional space for you. Over time, children adapt. They stop asking. They stop expressing. They stop expecting support. Not because they no longer need it, but because needing things begins to feel unsafe. This is why so many adults apologize before asking for help. They apologize for taking up space, apologize for having feelings, apologize for setting boundaries, apologize for existing in ways that require care. And eventually, the pattern becomes so normal that it feels like personality. But it isn't personality. It's adaptation. You may find yourself saying yes when you want to say no, agreeing when you disagree, remaining silent when something hurts, taking responsibility for everyone else's comfort while neglecting your own. Because somewhere deep inside, a younger part of you learned an important lesson. My needs come second, or perhaps my needs don't matter. But here's the truth many people never hear. Your needs were never the problem. The environment simply had no space for them. And when we understand that difference, something begins to change. Because healing is not learning how to become less needy. Healing is learning that having needs is part of being human, not something that requires permission. Section 5. Emotional neglect. In adulthood. One of the reasons emotional neglect is so difficult to identify is because it often hides behind behaviors society rewards. People-pleasing, perfectionism, independence, achievement, responsibility. From the outside, these qualities can look admirable, but underneath them, there is often a question. What happens if I stop? What happens if I'm no longer useful? What happens if I disappoint someone? Many adults living with emotional neglect become highly skilled at managing life, but privately they feel disconnected, lonely, exhausted, not because they lack people around them, but because they learned how to perform connection rather than experience it. They know how to meet expectations, but have no idea how to identify their own desires. And this creates a kind of loneliness that is difficult to explain. Being surrounded by people while feeling unseen, being needed while feeling unknown, being valued for what you do rather than who you are. This is the hidden legacy of emotional neglect. Not simply emotional pain, but emotional disconnection. A life spent adapting to everyone else while becoming increasingly disconnected from yourself. And eventually healing invites a different possibility. Not asking, how do I become more useful? But asking, who am I when I'm no longer trying to earn my place? That question changes everything. Because healing is not about becoming better at adaptation. It's about reconnecting with the self that adaptation required you to abandon. The roles you were forced to become. If emotional neglect teaches a child that their needs don't matter, something else happens too. The child begins searching for a way to belong, a way to stay connected, a way to remain safe. And children are incredibly creative when it comes to survival. Some become caretakers. Some become peacekeepers. Some become perfectionists. Some disappear completely. Some become the family scapegoat. Different roles, the same purpose. Survival. The important thing to understand is that these roles were never your identity. They were adaptations, strategies created by a younger version of you, trying to navigate an environment that could not fully meet your emotional needs. And the longer we live inside those roles, the more difficult it becomes to separate who we are from what helped us survive. That's exactly where we're going next. Because in Part 3, we're going to explore the roles you were forced to become. Not to blame yourself, not to blame your family, but to understand the difference between adaptation and identity. Because healing begins when you realize you are not the role, you are the person underneath it. And that person deserves to be known.